The land stretched as far as the eye could see, rolling green fields broken only by a winding dirt road, a few scattered oaks, and the faint outline of an old wooden fence that had been there for generations. On a clear morning, the wind carried the smell of earth and wildflowers, the kind of scent that felt like home to anyone who had worked the soil long enough to understand its language. For Thomas Weaver, that land wasn't just property. It was legacy. It was history. It was his family's story carved into the very roots beneath it. Thomas's grandfather had bought the land back in the 1940s, long before the county even had a proper zoning board. He built a modest farmhouse on the hill, raised his children there, and passed the property down through a single, unbroken line. Thomas grew up hearing about how every boundary marker, every stone, every post had been measured by hand, walked by foot, and recorded in ink so old it had started to fade. To anyone else, it was just 80 acres of open land sitting quietly on the outskirts of a growing town. But to Thomas, it was his inheritance, one he never intended to give away. No matter how much the world around him changed, he had watched as, over the years, the nearby fields were cleared and paved, replaced by strip malls, gas stations, and endless rows of houses that all looked the same. People called it progress. Thomas called it invasion. By 2020, a new housing project called Maple Ridge Estates had started taking shape just a few miles down the road. Thomas had seen the signs go up: smiling families, perfect lawns, shiny new cars and driveways. It was the kind of polished dream that real estate agents sold with easy smiles and cheap coffee. At first, it didn't concern him. His land sat just beyond the planned area, or so he thought. But then one morning, something strange happened. He woke to the sound of heavy machinery. At first, he assumed it was road work. But when he stepped outside, coffee cup in hand, he saw them: bulldozers and excavators rumbling across his property line. Bright orange survey flags fluttered in the wind where his old fence once stood. The machines carved trenches deep into the soil, churning through decades of untouched earth. He called out to one of the workers, but the man just waved and pointed toward a set of blueprints on the hood of a truck. Thomas walked over, looked down at the plans, and felt his stomach twist. The lines didn't just cross his land, they claimed it entirely. He asked to see a supervisor, but the man brushed him off, saying the Silver Creek HOA had full authorization from the county. Thomas laughed, thinking it had to be a mistake. But the laughter didn't last long. That evening, he drove into town and visited the county office. He expected a quick fix, a misunderstanding, a few papers out of place. But when he showed his deed and pointed to the coordinates, the clerk frowned. She pulled up digital maps that looked different. His land had been redrawn. The new zoning map ended right before his fence line. Everything beyond it was labeled as part of Silver Creek Phase 2. Thomas stared at the screen, stunned. The clerk offered a half-hearted apology, but it was clear she didn't want to get involved. According to the county's database, the land belonged to the HOA's development company. It had been acquired as part of an annexation deal last year. The problem was, no one had told Thomas. He went home with a sick feeling in his chest. Under the dim porch light, he pulled out his grandfather's deed, unfolded the yellowed paper, and compared it to the county printouts. The difference was clear. Somewhere, somehow, someone had shifted the boundaries. Over the next few days, he tried everything: calls, letters, meetings. He even spoke with the HOA's local representative, who promised to look into it. But weeks passed, and the construction didn't stop. The machines kept digging. Concrete trucks came and went. Roads were paved, curbs poured, driveways shaped. It was like watching someone erase his family history with every scoop of dirt. By the time Thomas hired a private surveyor to double-check, it was already too late. The foundation for the first row of houses had been laid. The surveyor, an older man named Bill, shook his head when he finished measuring. "They're about half a mile deep into your property," he said, rolling up his plans. "It's not just a small mistake. They've built entire streets on your side." Thomas didn't respond right away. He just stood there, staring at the rows of wooden frames rising where his wheat once grew. He could have stopped it then. He could have filed a complaint, called the police, made a scene. But he didn't. Instead, he did something that surprised even him. He told Bill to finish the report, notarize it, and keep a copy. Then he went back home, sat on his porch, and watched the sun set over the unfinished houses. Weeks turned into months. The development grew fast and too fast. Families started moving in. Children rode bikes up and down his old pasture. The HOA put up signs. "Welcome to Silver Creek, a proud community." Thomas smiled every time he passed the sign. Let them build, he thought. Let them settle. Let them dig deeper into the hole they didn't know they were in. He fixed his fence quietly, not to mark his claim, but to keep history intact. He knew what the papers in his safe said. He knew what the law said. He knew one day, when the time was right, he wouldn't need to shout. All he'd have to do was show them the deed, and when he did, the whole town would finally see who really owned Silver Creek. The weeks that followed were filled with an eerie stillness, like the calm before a storm that no one realized was forming. The sound of construction still echoed across the fields that bordered my land, but something about it had changed. There was an intensity to it now, a kind of hurried energy. Trucks came earlier, left later, and the once quiet mornings were now invaded by engines, hammers, and shouting. It was as if the developers were racing against time, though I didn't yet know why. My land sat just beyond the development's edge. Or so I thought. Every morning I'd walk my property line, tracing the worn wooden posts that had been there for decades. My grandfather had placed them himself, back when this land was just farmland and dreams. But one morning something caught my eye. A new stake, bright orange, driven deep into the soil, stood a few feet inside my property. It wasn't mine. It wasn't from my surveyor. It was from them. At first I assumed it was a mistake. Boundaries can be tricky after all. But as I looked closer, my stomach began to twist. There were more of them. Dozens. Bright, unnatural specks against the brown earth, slicing through what I knew was my territory. They weren't building near my property anymore. They were building on it. When I reached out to the site manager, a man in his mid-40s with an immaculate helmet and an expression carved from corporate confidence, he brushed me off with polite indifference. "We have all the approvals," he said, barely glancing up from his clipboard. "Our survey team verified everything." His tone made it sound final, as if paperwork could override ownership, as if my family's land meant nothing compared to a stack of blueprints and investor timelines. Days turned into weeks, and the invasion spread. Concrete foundations appeared where wild grass used to sway. Trucks dumped gravel over what had been my great-grandfather's old orchard. I could almost hear his voice in the rustling wind, a whisper of disbelief and sorrow. One evening, I stood at the edge of my property and watched as they poured the foundation for yet another home. The workers laughed and shouted as if celebrating. I felt invisible, a spectator to my own land being taken. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old farmhouse seemed to echo the sound of progress stealing pieces of my past. I decided to take action. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. It was a small brick building with peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights, a place where time seemed to move slower. I explained the situation to the clerk, an older woman with sharp glasses and a calm voice. She pulled up the digital maps and property records, scrolling through pages with methodical precision. Then she stopped, her brow furrowed. She zoomed in, checked another database, and frowned deeper. Finally, she turned to me with a look I'll never forget, part confusion, part alarm. "According to this," she said, tapping the screen, "the development's boundary extends past their approved area, onto parcel 14413B. That's your land." A chill spread through me. I asked if it could be a clerical error, but she shook her head. The permits had been approved based on incorrect coordinates. Somewhere in their rush, someone had copied a line wrong, and now nearly half the project was technically on private property. Mine. That was when I realized this wasn't just a small mistake. This was negligence on a massive scale. Over the next few days, I hired my own surveyor, a man named Harris who had worked the area for 30 years. He came out with his GPS rig and spent hours walking the perimeter, double-checking every marker. When he finished, he called me over. His expression told me everything. "They're over by at least 2 acres, he said, gesturing toward the new homes rising in the distance. "Maybe more. You've got them boxed in whether they know it or not." The words hit me like a jolt of electricity. I felt anger, vindication, and disbelief all at once. 96 homes, driveways, mailboxes, fences, all built on my property. And yet I hadn't signed a single piece of paper. I hadn't sold an inch of land. The next morning, I called the developer's office and requested a meeting. They agreed, likely thinking it was a minor complaint. When I arrived, the project manager looked surprised to see me holding a folder of documents, my original deed, the survey maps, and the newly confirmed boundary report. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply laid the evidence on the table and watched as realization flickered behind his eyes. He asked for time. He said they'd review the findings, but I could already sense the panic setting in. Construction halted for 2 days. Trucks disappeared. Workers milled about without direction. Then, just as suddenly, the noise resumed, louder, more frantic than before. They were trying to finish before I could stop them, and that was when I knew this wouldn't be solved with polite conversations or paperwork. They had stolen my land, built homes on it, and now hoped I'd go away quietly. But I wasn't going anywhere. That night, as the sun dipped behind the half-finished rooftops, I stood on the hill overlooking the development. Rows of identical houses stretched across my fields, their windows glowing in the twilight. They looked peaceful, almost beautiful, but to me they were monuments of arrogance. The wind picked up, carrying the distant echo of hammers and saws. I took a deep breath and whispered to the dark horizon, not as a threat, but as a promise. They built on my land. Now they'd have to face the truth. The night after my discovery felt heavier than any before. I barely slept. Every creak in the floorboards of my old farmhouse seemed to remind me of what was happening beyond those walls. A quiet war being fought over soil, cement, and arrogance. They thought I wouldn't fight back. They thought a single man couldn't stand against a corporation with lawyers, money, and influence. But they had no idea what they'd started. When morning came, the first rays of light revealed the scars on my land. Bulldozer tracks cutting through my field, half-buried fence posts, and stacks of construction material sitting squarely where my grandfather's orchard once bloomed. I walked to the edge again, the dew still clinging to the grass, and watched as the workers went about their business, completely unaware that the ground beneath them no longer belonged to them. For the first time, I noticed something strange. The construction site was unusually quiet, no music, no chatter. The workers seemed on edge, glancing toward the office trailers and whispering to one another. Something was happening behind the scenes. Later that day, I received an email. It was from the development company's legal department. They wanted to discuss a potential resolution and avoid unnecessary escalation. I could almost hear the desperation in their corporate politeness. It confirmed what I already suspected. They'd verified my claims. They knew the truth now, and they were scrambling. I agreed to meet. The following morning, I walked into their sleek glass office downtown. The reception area smelled of money, polished marble floors, chrome accents, and fake plants that looked more alive than the people who worked there. They led me into a conference room where 3 people waited: the project manager, a corporate lawyer, and someone new, a man in a dark suit with a subtle air of authority. He introduced himself as a regional director. They tried to smooth it over with smiles and rehearsed empathy. They called it a survey discrepancy, a technical overlap, a correctable issue. Their words were as carefully built as the houses sitting on my land. But beneath the polished language was fear. I could see it in their eyes every time I mentioned the word deed. I let them talk. I let them twist the story, minimize it, sanitize it. And when they finished, I slid a copy of my deed across the table, followed by Harris's survey report, marked, measured, and irrefutable. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, the regional director leaned back, clasping his hands. "We can offer compensation," he said, careful not to admit fault. "A fair price for the affected land, but it wasn't about money. This was my home, my legacy, my family's ground. I wasn't going to sell it just to make their mistake disappear. So I told them, as calmly as I could, that I expected the land restored or the homes removed. The look on their faces said everything. They hadn't expected defiance. They'd expected a payout in silence. The meeting ended coldly. No handshakes, no smiles. Just the quiet hiss of power losing control. In the days that followed, things grew tense. Construction slowed again, but didn't stop. They were betting that I wouldn't follow through, that I didn't have the money or resources to fight them legally. And for a moment, I almost believed it. Lawsuits cost money, time, energy. But then I remembered what was at stake. I reached out to a local journalist who had covered land disputes before. Her name was Emily, and when I told her what happened, her shock quickly turned to determination. "96 homes," she said, "built on the wrong property? That's not a story. That's a scandal." A week later, the story hit the local paper. The headline was bold and impossible to ignore. "Developer builds entire neighborhood on private property. Owner fights back." The article spread like wildfire. It hit online blogs, regional outlets, and even a few national pages. Overnight, my quiet fight became public. Reporters started showing up at the site. Neighbors stopped me at the store to ask if it was true. And then something incredible happened. People started supporting me, letters, emails, offers from lawyers who wanted to take the case pro bono just to make a name off it. The company's public relations machine went into overdrive. They released statements about ongoing discussions and commitment to resolution. But behind the PR curtain, I knew they were terrified. Their investors were asking questions. The buyers of those new homes were too. And still, the construction continued, as if finishing the project might somehow make the mistake vanish. But I knew better. Each nail they drove in was another piece of evidence in my favor. Then one afternoon, I received something unexpected. A letter from a family, one of the first to have bought a home in the development. They'd seen the article and realized their dream home might not be theirs at all. The mother wrote that they'd invested their life savings into it, and now they didn't even know who legally owned their land. Reading it broke something inside me. It wasn't just about me anymore. This wasn't only my fight. It was a mess that was about to destroy dozens of lives. That night, I stood outside again, the wind brushing against the tall grass. The glow of streetlights from the half-finished neighborhood flickering in the distance. I thought about all the people who would soon discover that their home stood on stolen ground. I thought about the arrogance that had led to this, the signatures, the oversight, the sheer greed. I realized I was holding not just leverage, but responsibility. The deed in my possession wasn't just a legal document, it was the truth they couldn't bury. So, I decided on the next step. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer who specialized in property and corporate fraud. We spent hours going over every piece of documentation, every survey, every timestamp. When we were done, he looked up from the table and said, "You have an airtight case." For the first time in months, I felt something that had been missing: power. I wasn't just defending my land anymore. I was preparing to expose everything, and I knew the moment I filed that lawsuit, the entire town would shake. Because when you build 96 homes on the wrong land, the truth doesn't just destroy buildings, Mike, it destroys reputations. The storm hadn't begun yet, but I could feel the thunder coming. The courthouse sat at the edge of town, an old sandstone building with tall columns and weathered steps that had seen generations of arguments, confessions, and verdicts. That morning, as I climbed those steps with my lawyer beside me, a strange calm washed over me. The air was still but heavy, the kind of silence that comes before thunder splits the sky. In my hand was a folder, the deed, the surveys, the photos, and the map overlays that proved everything. I wasn't just carrying evidence. I was carrying years of history, the weight of a legacy that had been quietly trampled by concrete and greed. When we entered the clerk's office, my lawyer placed the papers on the counter. The clerk, a man with kind eyes and a tired smile, looked at the title page, then at me and nodded slowly. "This one's going to make some noise," he said quietly. I simply replied, "That's the idea." By noon, the lawsuit was filed. Within 24 hours, the news broke like wildfire. Homeowner sues developer for building 96 homes on his land. It was on every local network, every online headline, every gossip feed in town. Cameras showed up at the development gates. News vans parked along the main road. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering, pointing, and speculating. I didn't want fame. I wanted justice. But fame came anyway. The developer's PR team released a statement within hours, calling it a misunderstanding and assuring buyers that their investments were protected. But no amount of polished words could stop the panic spreading through the neighborhood. Some residents started calling the county offices, demanding answers. Others contacted lawyers of their own, and then came the part they didn't expect: silence. For the first time in months, construction stopped completely. The site gates were locked. Workers stood outside, confused and idle, waiting for orders that wouldn't come. The skeleton of a half-built home stood at the far edge of my land, its wooden frame creaking in the wind, as if the earth itself was protesting. Over the next few weeks, the battle moved from the fields to the courtroom. The developer tried every trick in the book, delaying motions, partial admissions, corrective filings. But my lawyer was relentless. Every piece of evidence they tried to downplay, we turned into a spotlight. I remember one particular day in court. The developer's attorney, a polished man with a perfect tie and a colder smile, stood up and claimed that the boundary line was ambiguous. My lawyer countered by projecting a satellite image on the courtroom wall. It showed every home, every driveway, every inch of misplaced land, overlaid with my official deed lines glowing bright red. There was no ambiguity. When the image filled the courtroom, there was a murmur, reporters whispering, a few gasps from the gallery. Even the judge leaned forward. That was the moment everything shifted. The company realized they couldn't hide behind corporate language anymore. They'd built a neighborhood on the wrong land, and now the evidence was public record. After court, I stepped outside into a storm of flashing cameras. Reporters shouted questions, microphones pushed forward, voices overlapping. Do you plan to demolish the homes? Will you sell the land back? What about the families living there? I didn't answer right away, because the truth was I didn't know. At night, the farmhouse felt emptier than ever. The glow from the development still shimmered through my window, blue and gold lights flickering like distant stars. 96 homes, each one built where my orchard once stood. 96 families who had no idea that every square foot they walked on belonged to someone else. I couldn't sleep. The lawsuit wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about finding a way for everyone to live with what had been done. The next morning, a letter arrived. No return address, or just my name, handwritten. Inside was a single page. It was from one of the homeowners again, a young couple with 2 kids. They said they'd seen me on the news. They didn't blame me. They just wanted to know what would happen next. I sat there for a long time staring at that letter. It reminded me that beneath the concrete and contracts were real people, people who'd been deceived just as I had, so I decided to shift the fight's direction. Instead of pushing for demolition or damages alone, I instructed my lawyer to add a new demand: full accountability. We wanted not only restitution for the land, but a criminal investigation into how the permits were approved in the first place. Someone inside the county office had signed off on the wrong coordinates. Someone had looked the other way, and that was when things truly exploded. The story jumped from local to national coverage. News anchors debated it on morning shows. Legal analysts speculated about record-breaking settlements. And behind the scenes, quiet panic rippled through City Hall. Files disappeared overnight. Officials refused interviews. But leaks started pouring out. Emails, reports, and whistleblowers confirming what we suspected. This wasn't an accident. It was a cover-up. The developer had known months earlier that their survey was flawed. They chose to proceed anyway, gambling that no one would notice, and they lost that gamble the moment I showed them the deed. When the second hearing arrived, the courtroom was packed. I could feel the tension, the weight of dozens of families sitting behind me, waiting for answers. The company's lawyers were visibly strained now, their confidence cracking. They offered settlements, land trades, even gag orders disguised as amicable resolutions, but my lawyer refused them all. This wasn't about silencing truth. It was about setting a precedent that you can't bulldoze over people and hide behind paperwork. As the judge reviewed the evidence, he paused on one document, a copy of the original land approval form, signed by a county official whose name had mysteriously vanished from current employment records. The courtroom buzzed. Even the defense fell silent. By the end of that hearing, the judge ordered a temporary freeze on all transactions within the development. No sales, no transfers, no building permits. For the first time, the company was officially paralyzed. That evening, when I drove back to my farmhouse, the construction site was completely still. Not a single truck moved. The cranes stood frozen like skeletons against the sunset. The wind carried the faint rustle of tarps and loose nails, the remnants of ambition unraveling. For the first time since this began, I felt something that resembled peace. Not victory, not yet, but peace. Because the truth was no longer buried. The headlines that night read, Judge freezes $40 million development amid property dispute. My phone buzzed with messages from people across the country, landowners, lawyers, even former city employees, all telling me to keep going. To finish what I started, and I intended to, because this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something far bigger than I could have imagined. The land had been stolen. The homes were built. The lies had spread deep. But now the foundations of those lies were cracking. And once they did, everything built on them would come crashing down. The storm had arrived. And this time, I wasn't just a man defending his land. I was the reckoning they never saw coming. The morning after the judge's order, the town felt different. The neighborhood that had once been filled with the rhythmic hum of hammers and engines was now silent. Trucks stood parked like abandoned animals. Half-built homes sat frozen mid-construction, wooden frames reaching toward the gray sky like skeletons pleading for mercy. It was eerie, peaceful, but wrong. The kind of quiet that meant trouble was just beginning. The headlines had spread far beyond what anyone expected. National media outlets were running with the story. Pundits on morning shows called it the biggest land rights blunder of the decade. Social media was filled with outrage and fascination, people picking sides, analyzing every angle, digging for dirt, and soon, dirt began to surface. A local investigative reporter, Emily, the same journalist who had first broken the story, contacted me again. She'd been digging through county records and found something buried deep in the archives, a memo dated nearly a year before construction started. It was written by a county surveyor who had flagged discrepancies in boundary alignment during the permit approval stage. The memo had been ignored. Worse, it had been signed off anyway. The name on the approval form made my blood run cold. It was the same official whose signature had appeared on the fraudulent land documents from the court. Someone in the system had knowingly greenlit the project on false coordinates. That was the moment the story shifted from negligence to corruption. I met Emily in person that afternoon. We sat in a small cafe across from the courthouse, the air thick with caffeine and tension. She laid out the documents on the table, old county letters, maps, internal emails. "This wasn't a mistake," she said quietly. "They knew. They gambled you'd never notice, and she was right. If I hadn't walked my property line that morning months ago, they would have gotten away with it. 96 homes built on stolen land, buried under paperwork, forgotten by everyone except me." The next day, my lawyer filed a motion requesting a full investigation into county permitting fraud. It was a bold move, one that sent shockwaves through the local government. Within hours, the county commissioner's office released a statement promising full transparency. But behind that polished language, panic brewed. Whispers began circulating around town. A planning department employee had abruptly resigned. A developer executive was reportedly on leave. And late one night, a source leaked a file to Emily, internal company emails showing the truth. In one thread, dated just weeks before construction began, a project manager had warned his superiors that the boundary data may overlap with private land and that delaying the groundbreaking might be prudent until a resurvey is complete. The response from upper management was chilling. "Proceed. We'll handle any issues if they arise." They had gambled and lost. The following week, the county called for an emergency hearing. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, residents, and even a few of the new homeowners, people whose futures now hung in the balance. I stood on those same sandstone steps again, but this time I wasn't alone. The families who'd bought homes on my land had joined me. They weren't angry at me. They were angry at them. Inside the courtroom, my lawyer presented the new evidence. The judge's expression darkened as he read the leaked emails. The defense tried to argue that the communications were unauthorized and taken out of context, but the truth was already out. The room was thick with tension. Every person inside realizing that this wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was a scandal that could take down an entire company and expose deep cracks in local government. After the session, the judge expanded the freeze order. All construction halted indefinitely, and the developer's financial records were subpoenaed. The next day, the city buzzed with rumors. News trucks lined the streets. Protesters gathered outside the county offices, holding handmade signs. Justice for homeowners. No one is above the law. Stop corporate theft. Meanwhile, in the neighborhood that had once been their proudest achievement, the developers' signs were being torn down. Realtors pulled listings. Buyers backed out. And for the first time, the company's silence was deafening. But in that silence, something else began. The turning of allies into enemies. A week later, the first whistleblower stepped forward. A former construction supervisor admitted that he'd raised concerns about the property lines during the initial phase of development. He claimed he was told to focus on production, not paperwork. His testimony went public. Then another whistleblower came, a former county employee. She revealed that she'd been pressured by her boss to fast-track permits without full verification, under direction from above. It became clear this wasn't a mistake at all. It was collusion. A deal between power and profit, with my land as their silent victim. And yet beneath all the chaos, I began to see something remarkable. Unity. The families living in those 96 homes, once strangers to me, now stood beside me. They wanted justice too. They didn't want stolen land. They wanted the truth, even if it meant losing everything. We formed a coalition, the Landline Group. Homeowners, landowners, and legal advocates fighting together for restitution. We met weekly in my old barn, turning it into a makeshift headquarters filled with maps, legal documents, and determination. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very place my grandfather once stored tools and seeds was now where we were planting something else: justice. Then one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily called. "They're going to make a move," she said. "The developer's filing a counterclaim. They're blaming the county and calling themselves victims." It was predictable, desperate, and transparent. They were cornered now, fighting to shift blame anywhere but where it belonged, but I wasn't worried. Because this time I had everything I needed. The proof. The people. The truth. Still, I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Powerful people rarely accept defeat quietly, and deep down, I could feel something darker beginning to stir. A pushback. Quiet and unseen, from those who had the most to lose. The emails, the resignations, the lawsuits, and they were just the first cracks. But something told me those cracks were about to split wide open, and when they did, the whole rotten structure of greed, arrogance, and corruption that had been built on my land would finally come crashing down. The question was, how much damage would it do when it fell? It started with silence. Then came the whispers. At first, it was little things. Calls that dropped the moment I answered, cars idling too long near my driveway, letters with no return address slipped under my door. Nothing that could be proven. Nothing that could be reported. Just noise. But behind that noise, there was a pattern. Someone wanted me to feel watched. For weeks, I had been the one uncovering truths, cornering giants in courtrooms. Now it felt like they were watching me. One night around 2 a.m., I heard tires crunching on the gravel outside my house. When I peered through the curtain, I saw headlights aimed straight at my porch, unmoving. The engine idled for a long moment, then the lights shut off. Silence swallowed everything. I stood there in the dark, my heartbeat thundering. After a minute that felt like an hour, the car slowly backed away and disappeared into the night. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I found a note on my porch. No envelope. No signature. Just 3 words written in a jagged scrawl. "Drop it. Now." That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about land anymore. It was about power, the kind that doesn't lose quietly. The next few days blurred together in a storm of tension. My lawyer urged me to report everything to the police, but I knew how deep this went. The same county that had ignored fraudulent permits couldn't be trusted to protect me from those who had profited from them. Meanwhile, Emily's reports had ignited a firestorm. Every major outlet was covering the scandal now. Talk shows debated the ethics of development and property rights. Legal analysts speculated about criminal indictments. The developer's CEO, a polished man named Gareth Miles, finally appeared on camera. In a carefully worded statement, he claimed his company was misled by inaccurate government data, painting himself as a victim of bureaucratic error. "We sympathize with Mr. Harlan," he said smoothly, using my last name like a shield. But this was never about malice. It was about trust, Misplaced, perhaps, but never ill-intended. I nearly laughed when I saw it. The same man who had ordered his managers to handle any issues later was now pretending to be the wounded party. The public wasn't buying it. Social media turned his face into a meme overnight. The man who built on stolen ground. But behind the ridicule, I sensed something dangerous. Gareth wasn't a man who liked being humiliated, and he had resources, money, influence, and connections that stretched far beyond our little town. A week later, I drove to the courthouse for another hearing. As I turned into the parking lot, a black SUV swerved into my lane, forcing me onto the shoulder. My tires screamed. The SUV didn't stop, and it just sped past and disappeared. It wasn't an accident. I sat there shaking as adrenaline burned through me. Then I made a decision. If they wanted to scare me, they'd have to do better. That night, I installed cameras around my property, every angle covered. I began recording my calls, backing up my emails, saving every file in 3 different places. If they wanted a war, I was ready to fight with truth. The following morning, I received an email from an unknown address. The subject line read, "You're making a mistake." Attached was a single image, a grainy photograph of me leaving the courthouse the previous day. They were watching, constantly, but I wasn't the only one being targeted. Emily called me that evening, her voice trembling.
"Someone broke into my car," she said.
They didn't take anything. They just left a note. It said, "Stop digging." That was the moment we realized what we were up against wasn't just local corruption. It was a network of people desperate to bury the truth. Despite everything, the investigation pressed on. The state attorney had taken notice. Whistleblower testimony was now under federal review. Subpoenas were flying. The walls were closing in on the people who thought they'd never be caught. But desperation breeds recklessness. One afternoon, while meeting with the landline group in my barn, one of the homeowners, a woman named Dana, rushed in with panic in her eyes. "They're tearing down the model homes," she cried. We drove out there immediately. Bulldozers were parked near the site, and men in plain clothes were tossing blueprints into a dumpster. They were destroying evidence. I pulled out my phone, recording everything. "You can't do that," I shouted. "There's a court order." One of the men turned to me with a smirk. Orders change. We called the sheriff, but by the time an officer arrived, half the documents were gone. I handed over my footage, but I could tell the deputy didn't want to be involved. He just nodded, wrote a few notes, and left. That night, Emily aired the video on the evening news. It went viral within hours. Millions of views, thousands of comments. The story had become bigger than all of us now. This was no longer a local scandal. It was a national one. Days later, I got a call from a blocked number. "Mr. Harlan," a low voice said, "you think you've won because the media loves a hero? Heroes fall too." Click. I sat there in the dark kitchen, phone trembling in my hand. But as fear tried to creep in, another feeling rose to meet it. Resolve. They could intimidate, threaten, and smear my name all they wanted. But the truth was out now, and truth has a way of surviving the storm. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. My land, the same place where generations of my family had built their lives, now felt like a battleground. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of headlights through the window made me wonder who was out there. But the scariest part wasn't what they might do to me. It was what they might do next to keep their empire from collapsing. Because when powerful people start to fall, they don't go quietly. They drag everything and everyone down with them. And from the way things were moving, I knew this was just the beginning of their retaliation. The real fight hadn't even started yet. By the time the sun rose on the next week, the war had shifted. They no longer hid behind construction crews or anonymous threats. Now they attacked me in the open, in the press, in public records, even in courtrooms I hadn't stepped foot in. It began with an article. A small blog post from a local outlet I'd never heard of. Local landowner accused of tax fraud. Investigation pending. The story was thin, based on anonymous sources. But within hours, it was shared by dozens of other sites. And soon it wasn't just a rumor. It was everywhere. On social media, people debated my guilt like it was a spectator sport. My inbox filled with hate. Strangers called me greedy, corrupt, even a fraud. That's when I realized Gareth Miles and his company were using the oldest trick in the book: bury the truth under scandal. If they couldn't silence me physically, they'd destroy my reputation instead. A few days later, a manila envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside were photocopies of official-looking forms, fake tax returns, falsified signatures, and letters supposedly proving I'd been laundering land titles for years. It was absurd. But to the untrained eye, it looked real. Emily helped me trace the documents' origin. They were fabricated, almost certainly by someone inside Gareth's legal team. And yet, by the time we could prove it, the damage had already been done. News outlets that once painted me as a victim now used phrases like controversial landowner and alleged profiteer. The narrative had turned. Suddenly, I wasn't the man standing up for justice. I was the man standing in the way of progress. The stress took its toll. I barely slept. My hands trembled every time I checked the news. The once peaceful land around my house, the quiet fields and old oak trees, now felt like a battlefield scarred by invisible gunfire. One morning, as I went to collect the mail, I noticed something new: a camera crew parked across the street. They weren't journalists. They were hired photographers, waiting to capture an image that could be spun into another headline. Man at the center of scandal refuses to comment. I could already see the caption. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the edge of despair. I'd fought this battle with truth, with patience, with evidence. But truth wasn't as loud as lies, and the lies had microphones. Then came the lawsuit, filed by Gareth Miles Development Corporation. It accused me of defamation, harassment, and interference with business operations. The irony was suffocating. They had built 96 homes on my land, illegally, and now they were suing me for damages. It was a weaponized legal move, meant not to win, but to exhaust. My lawyer, Sam, explained it clearly. They're trying to drain you financially. If you can't keep up, they win by default. The case meant depositions, document requests, and hearings that stretched for months. Every filing cost money, every defense another sleepless night. Still, I refused to back down. I sold my truck, refinanced my property, and poured everything I had into fighting back. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about every homeowner, every farmer, every small-town landowner who had ever been crushed under the weight of money and influence. Meanwhile, Emily's network ran a follow-up documentary titled "Who Really Owns the Ground Beneath Us?" It told the full story: how permits were forged, how the county overlooked ownership records, and how one man's stubbornness exposed an empire built on deceit. That documentary changed everything. Public sympathy swung back. Comment sections flooded with outrage. Give him his land back. Lock up the developers. Justice for Harlan. But Gareth wasn't done. If the public couldn't be turned, he'd strike where it hurt most: my credibility in court. During one hearing, their attorney stood before the judge with a smug grin. "Your Honor," he began, "we've uncovered evidence that Mr. Harlan knowingly altered his property boundaries 5 years ago." He held up an old survey map. Edited. Of course. I watched the judge's expression tighten. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then my attorney stood and calmly handed the court clerk a flash drive. On it was a full chain of custody, the original time-stamped files, and GPS metadata proving the forgery. Silence filled the courtroom. The judge glared at Gareth's legal team and demanded an explanation. They stumbled, stammered, and requested a recess. That moment, that single, frozen instant, was the first real crack in their armor, and like a hairline fracture under pressure, it began to spread. 2 days later, the county commissioner resigned. 3 permits were revoked. The state attorney's office launched an official investigation into Miles Development Corp. Gareth's empire was crumbling, piece by piece. But for every small victory, another attack followed. My phone was hacked. My credit card accounts frozen. Emails leaked. It felt like living in the center of a tornado. Calm one moment, destruction the next. One night, Emily called me again. Her voice was serious. "You're on a list," she said quietly. "Someone leaked an internal memo. They're trying to blacklist you from every construction or land-related contract in the state." I laughed bitterly. "Then we're getting close," I said. "They only try to erase people who scare them." Despite everything, I still drove out to the fields every evening. The skeletal frames of the half-finished houses stood like monuments to greed, silent, broken, and lifeless. I'd park the car, step out, and watch the sun bleed orange across the rooftops. That land wasn't just property anymore. It was proof. Proof that corruption could be challenged, that one person's persistence could shake the foundations of something far bigger. But the battle wasn't over. Gareth still had influence, and now that his company was bleeding, he was desperate. A cornered animal is dangerous. And Gareth Miles was cornered. Rumors began circulating that he was planning something drastic, a full-scale countersuit, maybe even bankruptcy to avoid penalties. Some said he'd disappear overseas with the remaining funds. Others whispered darker things, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever he was planning, it would happen soon. And when it did, it would either destroy him completely or drag me down with him. The day of reckoning arrived beneath an overcast sky. By the time I reached the courthouse steps, reporters lined the sidewalks like a living corridor of flashing lights and microphones. My story had gone national now, not just a local scandal or a curiosity on social media. It had become a symbol, a man versus a machine, truth versus corruption, David versus Goliath, one last time. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. The gallery was full, neighbors, journalists, even a few of the families who had unknowingly bought homes on my land. They sat together, united by the quiet understanding that what happened here would ripple far beyond this town. Across the room, Gareth Miles sat flanked by a wall of attorneys. His once slick confidence was gone. His suit hung loose, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. The empire that had once built entire neighborhoods was now crumbling around him, and he knew it. Still, he tried to smile when our eyes met. It wasn't arrogance anymore. It was desperation disguised as composure. The judge entered, gavel striking wood like a thunderclap. The final hearing had begun. For weeks, evidence had poured in, forged permits, falsified survey data, internal emails showing Gareth's personal approval of the illegal development. But today's session was different. It wasn't about speculation anymore. It was about proof. Emily sat in the front row, her notepad resting on her lap. Every word, every reaction, every tremor of truth would be documented. When my attorney rose to speak, the room fell silent. "Your Honor," he said steadily, "we present the original deed registered with the county in 1964, verified by 3 independent surveyors. The land upon which the 96 homes were built has never been transferred, sold, or subdivided. Ownership remains, and always has remained, with Mr. Harlan." He placed the document on the judge's bench, the same parchment I'd held in my hands countless nights, the proof of everything I'd fought for. It looked small, ordinary. But that single sheet of paper carried the weight of generations, the truth of a lifetime. The judge adjusted his glasses and examined the document. Then he looked up at Gareth. "Mr. Miles," he said, "do you have any legal evidence to counter this claim?" Gareth's lead attorney stood, papers trembling slightly in his hands. "Your Honor, we believe—" But before he could finish, the judge cut him off. "Belief is not evidence. You've had ample opportunity to produce proof. You've failed." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge leaned back, exhaling heavily. "This court rules in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Harlan. The land and all properties built upon it were constructed without authorization, under falsified documentation. All operations under Miles Development Corporation are hereby suspended pending further investigation by state and federal authorities." The gavel struck once more. Just like that, it was over. The sound echoed through the room. Final, resonant, absolute. For a moment, I couldn't move. I just sat there staring at the floor, my breath caught somewhere between disbelief and relief. It felt unreal, like the sound of justice was too quiet for what it represented. Across the aisle, Gareth's shoulders slumped. The color drained from his face as the reality settled in. The reporters surged forward, shouting questions. Cameras flashed. Emily's voice cut through the noise. Not a question, but a statement. He won. Those two words broke whatever spell had frozen me. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of every sleepless night, every insult, every threat finally lift. For the first time in years, the ground beneath my feet felt mine again. In the following weeks, the fallout was monumental. Federal agents raided the offices of Miles Development Corporation. Bank accounts were frozen, hard drives seized, employees questioned. The County Planning Commission faced resignations and indictments. News outlets ran headlines that seemed almost unreal. Developer empire collapses after land fraud scandal. 96. Homes built on wrong property. Homeowner wins landmark case. Families who had purchased homes on my land were terrified, afraid they'd lose everything. But instead of turning against me, they reached out. Together we found a way. Through a joint settlement and restructured ownership, they kept their homes, legally this time. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. Gareth Miles, once a celebrated figure in the real estate world, disappeared from public view. Rumors said he fled the country. Others claimed he declared bankruptcy and vanished into some quiet coastal town. It didn't matter. His empire was gone, erased by the truth he thought he could bury. And as for me, I didn't rebuild right away. I didn't rush to sell or develop. I let the land breathe again. There were days I'd walk along the fence line, past the remnants of the construction, piles of unused timber, half-faded sold signs still stuck in the ground. The wind would sweep across the fields, carrying the smell of earth and grass, and I'd think about everything that had been lost and everything that had been saved. It wasn't victory that I felt. It was peace, hard-earned and fragile, but real. One afternoon, Emily returned for a follow-up segment. She filmed me standing at the edge of the property, the empty shells of homes behind me, the wide horizon stretching beyond. Her narration would later become one of the most watched pieces in her career. In a world where greed often wins, she said, one man's refusal to surrender reminded us that land isn't just property, it's legacy. The video went viral overnight. Millions watched, commented, and shared it. Messages poured in from across the country. Farmers, homeowners, even city dwellers who'd fought their own battles with HOAs, developers, or bureaucracy. They all said the same thing. Thank you for not giving up. That meant more than any legal victory ever could. A year later, the site of those 96 illegal homes became something new. Not a housing project, not a shopping center, but a memorial garden. A space dedicated to fairness, community, and the reminder that ordinary people can still stand against impossible odds. We called it Harlan Grove. The townspeople helped plant trees and flowers. Families painted benches in bright colors, and kids played where court battles once raged. Standing there during the dedication ceremony, I realized that what had started as one man's fight for his land had grown into something much greater. It had become a story, a living, breathing proof that justice, though slow, always finds its way home. And as the wind rustled through the trees that day, I felt my father's voice in the breeze. Faint but certain. You did right, son. You protected what's ours. Now, when I sit on that same porch at dusk, watching the last light fade over the fields, I don't think about the lawsuits or the headlines anymore. I think about what the land means, not as an asset, but as a promise that no matter how powerful the world's Goliaths may seem, there will always be a David willing to stand his ground, and sometimes all it takes to win is holding on to the truth no matter how heavy it gets.